Hello, everybody. This is Allison Zuniga, and I will be presenting Chapter 5, which is called Industrial Benchmarking, a Research Method for Education, and it was written by Marc Tucker. So I'd like to start off with an essential question that I found early in the chapter on page 118. The question says, what are the differences in system design that account for variations in national education performance, and how would we find the answer to the question? So the goal of this presentation is sort of to explore this essential question and to see what kind of conclusions Tucker is able to arrive at. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what industrial benchmarking is and what this has to do with education. So I'd like to begin with a story about a person named David Kearns and the company Xerox. In the late 1970s, Xerox was a technology company that was at the top of the market at the time. You could imagine it was actually compared to the Apple or the Google of its day. And they hired David Kearns as CEO. At around this time, there was a Japanese company, Ricoh, that became its biggest competitor. Part of what made it its biggest competitor is that they were able to produce the same or very, very similar printer at a much cheaper cost, and they were able to sell them also much cheaper, and they were able to produce them very quickly. So at this time, Kearns, as the new CEO, had to make a decision. He had to decide if he should prepare for market death or rise above. What he chose was rising above, and this is how we arrived at the birth of industrial benchmarking. So industrial benchmarking follows these basic steps, and it can also be applied to educational research goals. In these steps, the first thing to do is when you're examining the successes of other countries, you choose which countries you would like to study and you narrow it down so that you could actually go and visit them. This was originally started in business or an industry by Kearns in the late or early 1980s when he wanted to go and investigate what was happening in Japan with the Ricoh company. This can also now be applied to educational research goals when we look abroad and look at other countries and how they're doing better on certain performance tests and better than we are doing. How can we be more like them? The second step is to build libraries of relevant data, information, and analyses to compile. Then you're going to want to identify in-country experts who can give you a background about what it is that they're doing, how they're getting these results, what their practices are, maybe just walk you through a day or a couple days in their shoes. Then you're going to want to start to build a framework about what you're witnessing. Pick your team that you're going to have go with you, and then prepare your team, and finally allow yourself to be confused and then to put the whole picture together. I think this last point is probably the most significant because Tucker said that in the first day that you're there, you're going to try to imagine all of the solutions that you're seeing applied to your situation. You say, oh, that's it, I got it, I know what I'm doing, we can go. But by the second and third days, you start to realize and you get very confused by these realizations that in fact it's very different and that what you're witnessing is very specific to the circumstances in which they're taking place. And then after a couple more days, you start to put the whole picture together. You realize that the solutions that are working for this particular country work for this country specifically because of the circumstances that it is in, and that you, instead of trying to replicate exactly what they're doing, you can get inspiration or draw inspiration from what they're doing and then apply it to your own situation back at home based on the circumstances that you are in. And then you're able to not only meet what they're doing, but actually beat what they're doing. So again, the idea is that you're going to visit, then you're going to learn, you're going to do a lot of imagining, and you're going to be confused, you're going to find some clarity, and then this is going to lead to some inspiration. So inspiration leads to improvement and innovation, but not replication. So Tucker did examine a couple of different situations in which we would like to do better as a country. The United States has fallen behind, especially in math and science in those areas. And so we look to other countries for solutions. We say, well, how are people in Finland doing so well? How is the system of education in Finland doing so well? How are some of the countries in the Asian continent doing so well in their math and science? So let's take a closer look at some of the reform that we can imagine has gotten lost in translation. So when we look to Finland, we look at Finland because we've seen Finland come sort of as an underdog in the last 20, 30 years or so since the end of the Cold War. Finland has had some unexpected success. We know them for having large investments in teachers. We know them for having high student performance and one of the highest quality educational systems in the world. However, what we don't really see at first. We don't immediately see, and this is this is where things get lost in translation as far as solutions that we can apply to our own situation. What we don't see is the history of Finland as recently as the fall of the Soviet Union. What we don't maybe recognize is that before the fall of the Soviet Union, Finland was exporting a lot of their goods to the Soviet Union, and they were one of their biggest economic suppliers. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, Finland had to make a choice. They recognized that they didn't have any natural resources that they could use to support their economy. And so what they did is they went back to the basics. They relied on their tendency to be tribal. So one of the biggest differences between the US and Finland is in the core of its culture. The Finnish tend to be very tribal, whereas in the United States, we are basically the opposite. We're very individualistic. So in this case, the Finnish got together and they decided to give the decision to the elders in this case, in the particular tribe or the tribal feel. So the elders decided that the best thing that they could do would be to invest in their youth and focus on technology to make sure that the youth were highly trained so they could compete in a high-tech market because they saw that this is what was the next big thing and that this is something that they didn't need to have natural resources. They could just invest in the knowledge and the skills of their youth. The Finnish agreed. The youth took over, they took charge, and then they invested in their education, and then becoming a teacher actually became equated with national pride. So again, a lot of what we don't see immediately in the success of Finland's educational system is sort of the social and political history of the country and how that has created a situation where Finland was able to completely restructure and redirect their educational system to what it is today. When we looked at the Asian countries versus the United States that Tucker discussed, he discussed the fact that we tend to see big successes in math and science in the Asian countries, and that there is a solid foundation of knowledge with a great respect for teachers in these countries. And what's interesting that Tucker pointed out was that what the Asian countries tend to see is that the US is envious because they produce people who are able to think creatively, that we have original thinkers, that we have skilled entrepreneurs, and they wish that their students were more like that. But again, we see a lot of social restrictions and limitations in the Asian countries and a lot of freedom in the United States. And so those cultural elements, again, create circumstances in which it makes sense that rigorous math and science courses and educational respect is high in Asian countries, whereas the United States, we have a lot of creativity, we have a lot of original thinkers, but we lack some of the more rigorous expectations within our educational system. And finally, we looked at the relationship with testing, and basically it was the United States versus everybody else in this case. The United States, we really don't like teaching to the test. We do not have state curriculum. Tests here are much cheaper to produce, and they're not strongly tied to the future of the students. Students could easily not take the SAT or the ACT, and they could still go to a community college and eventually transfer without having to take that. Many other countries, they have students' futures very much largely tied to exams that they take in school. So automatically there's a lot more pressure and there's higher stakes that are tied to those tests, which then in turn are going to produce students who work harder and study more because they want to have a good future. There's also a lot of money spent on high quality exams that are used in other countries that tie in with this idea that tests are very important, and that's translated down to the kids. So how can we be more like them? Unfortunately, we cannot just copy anybody. There is a lot of reform movements that do get lost in translation because we just have different cultural and social and political circumstances in the countries in which these reforms are taking place and in which they're succeeding. So what does this mean for us? If the principal sources of academic weakness lie in the basic design of our system, why would we expect to significantly improve student outcomes unless we change the system? So, this was a question that was posed by Tucker. And Tucker's argument was that educational research should model itself after industrial benchmarking because we must understand why some other countries' systems are outperforming our own before we can revise our system. And we need to make information to make our system better than any other country that currently exists or any other system that currently exists. So I'm going to return to this idea of gestalt that was in the beginning of the globe on my front page. And this is to understand how to make a better system, we must understand all relevant layers and connections. To reach gestalt, we need to use industrial benchmarking. So we must, quote, study the larger context in which the object of the study is embedded with special attention to the connections among the elements of the system that accounts for superior outcomes. So what I thought was interesting about this concept is that we really do tend to see the center of a huge spider web and we see the solution just sitting right there in the middle, but what we don't understand is that getting to that solution is just it's in the middle, it's just mixed in and embedded within all of these other elements that have influenced the positioning of that particular solution. So for this assignment, we were asked to find another resource from this author. So I found an article that was written a year after Change Wars was published, and this is called "Changing the System is the Only Solution." It's by Tucker. So essentially, we know that we need to change the system, our system of education. How do we change it if we can't just if we can't just replicate what other people are doing? So in this article, Tucker made some suggestions, including changing the hiring practices. In this article, Tucker proposes that states should control hiring and firing processes and take it away from local control. He says that also the patronage system will disappear and deter traditional applicants to school boards. So part of what Tucker's argument was based on was that school boards tend to be sort of like a stopping or stepping stone or stopping place for people who want to maybe use that position for advantages, for personal advantages. And so if we took the control of hiring and firing away from the school boards and we put it in state control, we would eliminate the patronage system in the school boards. Additionally, he said that teacher association roles will change, provide consistent improved professional development across the country. There will be new role for school boards. So they will not be run. They were not run by local school boards. Instead, he would use a business competition model and actually hire third-party companies that were made up of teachers to contract out with the school districts. So as control leaves the school board, so does the school board as a stepping stone. And also district funding would be provided by states based on the need. So it was actually a really interesting argument. And finally, what he said was, if you don't like my proposal, then what would you do? Specifically, he said, quote, the American way of governing our schools is almost unique in the industrialized world. So is our high costs and relatively poor performance. Do you really think things are fine just as they are? If you do not like my proposals, what would you do? And the next part of this assignment was to connect what we read, or connect in this case, chapter 5, with my own problem of practice and innovation, and then two of my colleagues' work. So I have identified two people that I thought the concept of industrial benchmarking would work nicely with. So in my own connections, we know that countries like China, Japan, Singapore, and Finland are succeeding on performance-based measures in areas like math and science. We also know that the United States is working on catching up in these realms, although we are known for producing creativity, which is a strength. So what can we do to use our comparative knowledge and be on the cutting edge of improvement in the United States? Not to replicate, but to take what they're doing and perhaps do better. So in terms of my own innovation, I said, short of revamping the entire educational system, we can work on explicitly developing the ability of emotional intelligence for students, which is the innovation that I would like to do in order to increase the quality of social interaction during group projects. We can increase their emotional intelligence to increase their capacity to work with others who are from different backgrounds and have different skill sets. Okay. I also identified Erica Calloway, and her problem of practice. Her problem of practice discusses an emphasis on development that is expected for school district leaders. However, she said that this expectation has not resulted in opportunities for leaders across organizations. So, when I was reflecting on this particular problem of practice and the theory of industrial benchmarking, I believe that it has the power to cast a wider net of possibilities for system solutions. And I think that Erica's proposed innovation, which was the Leadership Development Institute, appears to be influenced by business principles and is supported by evidence. And so I wrote what I would think Tucker would ask, which would be, quote, is this enough for systemic change, or will the results be too small to make a long-lasting impact on developing leaders of school districts? So that was something to consider. And finally, I believe that Aaron, and Aaron's connection was very interesting. Aaron is working as a director of learning at an American school in Taiwan, and he's noted that students from Asian cultures have a difficult time adapting despite their strength in academics. And so this is the issue that needs to be resolved because students are dropping out because it's taking too long for them to adapt to the American school's way, which I think is very interesting. So the innovation that Aaron is using is the model of acculturation and the theory of self-efficacy to determine specific curriculum interventions to be used in an effort to increase self-efficacy of students from Asian cultural backgrounds and to prevent dropout. So I wrote here what I think Tucker would say based on the readings that we just did, which was to consider the Gestalt concept. These students have strengths in academics but continue to drop out. Is self-efficacy merely an American perception of a quick fix when the issue is much more complex? So again, going back to this idea of reconsidering what it is that makes things work in certain situations and cultural contexts. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation. Those are my references. Thank you for watching and goodbye.